Is this the face you show to your friends?
Your name.
The man put his hands flat on the counter and said, "Help me," and I felt suspicion spike in my chest before any thought had finished. He did not lift a face toward me. There was only a smooth oval where features should be. The skin looked taut like paper over a skull. I kept my hands on the register and kept my voice steady, because the only real thing in front of me was the voice and the demand. I was 22, 3 weeks into the night shift, and my first instinct was procedural. Card, pump number, price. Suspicion pushed my fingers to the drawer where the receipt paper lived. Doubt followed inside me. Did I move too fast? Did I say the wrong thing? And then fear arrived as a second. Colder layer when the man's shoulders didn't rise with a breath. Name, I said. He tilted his head at an extreme angle and answered in a voice that sounded like the register's speaker with thin static overlay. Even. The word landed wrong. The name tag pinned crooked to my shirt pinched my skin where it caught on thread. I heard my own thumb rub against the plastic, the nervous habit that had started the first week on graveyard shifts. That rubbing was visible evidence of my anxiety. I used it to steady my fingers, to keep them from running to the flashlight on my belt. I told him to step back so a customer from the pumps could approach the register, and he stepped so close the rim of his coat brushed the counter. The forecourt fluorescent buzzed and threw light across his coat fabric. I could see the rusted tokens clutched in one hand when he moved, and each token had the same dull circle stamped on it like a hole punched through years. Outside, headlights swept across cracked asphalt and then passed. A truck idled at the pump, radio low. I kept the register open between us. I kept repeating small sentences because keeping the interaction short felt safer. Do you need gas? I asked. Help me. He said again. Marla called in on my phone while I stalled. She sounded distant and bright in the ear, the daytime manager who thought night was a short inconvenience. Even, house the shift. You okay? She said. I'm okay, I said. My voice had an edge I didn't like. I kept my free hand between the man and the cigarette display because you learn fast that small gestures make people step back. Somebody at pump 3 wants to pay. Marla's voice, calm and clipped, didn't carry fear. She gave me procedural instructions like she always did on slow nights. Keep the receipt tape neat. No open food in the register. Call me if anything looks off. The faceless man moved his head and echoed her last word in my ear with perfect timing. Off. The timing made Ram Rez, the truck driver, glance up. He had the sleep, worn face of someone used to highway lights and coffee. You okay, man? Ramirez called across the pumps, and the faceless man mirrored the word back, slower. Okay. That mirroring was the first out, loud sign that this was not just a strange person, but that he studied immediate speech. I felt the first emotion shift then, suspicion into confused alarm, because I could no longer file this under weird drifter. I told Ram Rez to come up to the counter. Voice clipped and firm, and he did. Ram Rez walked in with the smell of oil on his jacket and a tin of mints in his hand. He set a card down, thumb humming against the plastic. Evening, he said, pump 3. Fill it? The faceless man tilted his head and repeated, fill it. Ram Rez laughed nervously. Okay. That's. He stopped, his smile thinned. He looked at the guy like he was trying to confirm a trick. I reached behind the register and my fingers closed on a corner of something damp and stiff. I pulled out the rulebook before I knew why. The cover was soft from water, and the handwriting inside was cramped and exact. Its first page had a list, and the second line read, always record the name the customer offers. When the customer offers none, give one and surrender it if asked. The ink had bled where a ring of coffee had sat. The pages smelled of browned paper and oil. that discovery pushed the next emotion shift, confusion into a hard, practical alarm. I read the lines aloud because reading aloud makes things concrete. Always record the name the customer offers, I said. And the faceless man leaned in like he needed me to finish the sentence. Marla, from the phone, even you sound off. What's the matter? It's nothing. A trucker. A weird customer. I found a book. I said, don't get involved with drunks. Lock the door if you need to. Call me if it gets weird. Her voice tried to sound in control, and stayed in the register of a manager who handles petty fights and price disputes. I looked down at my name tag and felt the weight of the book like an instruction. The rulebook had a margin note. Do not show the book to customers. Do not discuss rules outside staff. Violation removes them. The last line didn't define removed. The letters were small and squared, as if someone had pressed a fingertip into the page while writing. Ramirez paid and backed toward the pumps. The faceless customer followed his movements with small mirrored gestures. Every time Ramirez raised a hand, the faceless man raised a hand a beat later. Ramirez climbed into his truck. I handed him his receipt and said, Ramirez, watch, don't let him follow you. Ramirez laughed. What, guy's weird, man, I'll be fine. He turned back to the pump and reached for the nozzle. The faceless man stood on the edge of the lot where the sodium streetlight didn't quite reach him and copied Ramirez's movements as if he were practicing. I watched Ramirez depress the nozzle, and then the pump's display stuttered and blinked. The digits slipped to impossible numbers for a second, zeros where there should be prices, then snapped back. Ramirez frowned. What the hell? Ramirez muttered. The faceless man said, quieter now. What the hell? I felt the air in my throat tighten as physical sensation. My jaw locked, my hands slick with sweat. That was the third emotion shift, alarm moving into outright fear. The rule about time had a note scratched in the margin. Acknowledge the clock. Correct the register. Time must be known. I glanced then at the wall clock behind the counter. The hands pointed to 2:03, then I blinked and it read 2:02. I nudged the clock with my finger. It clicked and slid, and the second hand made a small jump. Ivan. Marla snapped. Are you adjusting the clock? There's a glitch. The pump just... I couldn't finish. Ramirez's truck was sputtering, the engine stalled, and then the man at the pump walked away as if he had somewhere to be. Ramirez reached for his door handle, and then the lot swallowed him. 1 second he was there with his jacket half on. 1 second the open air gave way to nothing, and his jacket lay on the asphalt, as if someone had pulled him through a hole in the dark. I heard the fabric slap the ground and nothing else. I dropped the rule book. The pages fanned, and a damp smear left a crescent print on the counter. The faceless man stood at the glass now, close enough that I could see the faint seams on his smooth face where eyebrows or a mouth might have been. He tapped the glass with the tip of a long, dirty fingernail. Even, he said, and the voice matched my own name this time, without the register delay. My hands moved because my brain was moving in procedure to keep movement from becoming panic. I reached for my name tag and felt the pin. The rulebook's line about giving a name rustled in my head. When the customer offers none, give one and surrender it if asked. The faceless man's hand was outstretched now, fingers like matchsticks. You don't have to do that. Marla on the phone, softer, even hold on. Don't give him anything, lock the door. Call the police. I tried to lock the door. The lock jammed for a heartbeat like someone had pressed a thumb inside it. My hand froze on the latch. The faceless man leaned forward so his breath would have been on the glass if he had a mouth. He tilted his head, and then he said, Give me your name. I could name other choices. Refuse and risk whatever the book warned about, or tear off the tag and hand it over. The book's ink looked like a list of consequences, not suggestions. I felt the final shift then, fear into grim compliance. My thumb found the seam of the plastic name tag and pulled. The pin caught and a line of skin stung where the pin scraped. The tag came away with a rustle and a small sound like paper tearing in a quiet room. I put the tag on the counter. I did not hand it to him. My hand was shaking enough that the tag slid to the book and landed on a page as if the book had taken it with a small, hungry sound. The faceless man did not touch it yet. He tilted his head, then extended a finger and brushed the edge. The tag stuck to his skin like a wet paper. "Thank you," he said. His voice had no gratitude in it. It had the flat acknowledgement of a mechanic closing a panel. I stood very still and listened for external sounds, car doors, the distant hum of the highway. But the pumps were quiet, and the lot was empty except for the truck tire tracks and the abandoned jacket. I tried to call Marla back. The line was dead. I tried to call the police. The number rang and then the tone went flat. The book's next instruction was scrawled out and then corrected. Record on paper. Keep one log, do not post. Surrender what is requested. Do not attempt to take back. Below that someone had written, smaller. If you refuse, they will take what is not yours to keep. I pressed my thumb to the scratch of the ink like it would transfer something and found only roughness. I cleared my throat and said, Are you leaving now?" He did not answer with words. He shifted backward the same way a person steps out of a puddle. The jacket that the truck driver had left lay still on the ground, and then I realized the jacket had a receipt tucked in a pocket. I walked outside because I needed an action, something to pin my hands to besides the book. The asphalt was cold under my sneakers. The receipt had Ramirez's name on the top line, Ramrez, printed from the pump, and a timestamp that read 2:03. The timestamp and the clock in the kiosk did not match. The pump's printed line and the wall clock were out of sync by 1 minute. That mismatch felt physically wrong, like a loose tooth. The rulebook's warning about time pressed on me. Correcting it mattered. I went back inside and set the clock to match the pump's receipt. The second hand stuttered and the fluorescent over the register pulsed once. When I turned back, the faceless man's coat was slouched as if it had been sitting too long. He reached into his satchel and produced a wrinkled paper bag. He lifted it as if to hide his face, and then folded the bag into the shape of a hat instead, incongruous and childish. "You did the right thing," he said. He used my name without prompting. That small borrowed courtesy made my mouth taste like copper. I had followed the steps in a sequence that the book commanded, and something had happened that resembled safety. The faceless man backed away from the counter and walked toward the pumps in a loose, patient gait. He stopped at pump 3 and set a token running through his fingers. He placed the token on the pump display, and it stuck there, caught in the seam where the plastic met metal. The light above the pumps hummed and dimmed until a thin band of light isolated him, and then the pump registered a small credit. I sat down on the stool behind the counter because my legs felt like they were about to give. My hands curled into fists. My mouth formed words and then didn't he say them. In my pocket my phone vibrated. A text from Marla that read, "Call me when you can." I started a written log because the book said to, because a recording felt safer than another phone call. I set a small voice recorder on the counter and pressed the red recording light. I held my breath and spoke into the device in measured sentences, the habit of someone teaching themselves to be witness. This is even Mercer. Night shift, Harper's gas station. Date unknown. First incident. Faceless customer appears at register, I said. I marked down the sequence of events in short lines. Time pump 3 mirror speech, rulebook under register, name tag surrendered, truck driver vanished. Recording made the events real on paper and on tape, and that reality felt like a small shelter. The rulebook lay open with the stain and the ink and the torn corner where my name tag had landed. The faceless man walked out across the lot, and the headlights of 2 cars passed. For a long stretch nothing changed. I told myself that was the end of it. Then the light above pump 1 went out with a tiny pop like a snapped wire. The faceless man stopped mid-step and turned back toward the kiosk. He folded his hands together in front of him in a motion that mimicked prayer. Then he yawned in a way that looked like a borrowed expression. I felt a movement inside me that wasn't quite bravery. It was calculation. I read the rule again, and the notation about not telling others hit harder. Keeping the book secret was not about shame. It was about containment. The book wanted to keep a shape on the way the world rearranged around this presence. I closed the recorder after 10 minutes and scrawled one more line in the log. If anyone reads this, do not bring this up to management. Follow these rules. The words felt wrong in my mouth, because I was telling someone to obey something that had taken a man from the lot. But the sentence was a choice, and choices were how you survived nights that changed their rules. Marla called twice more and then left a message that she would drive by in the morning. Ramirez did not return to pick up his jacket. The faceless man had gone when I looked out again, leaving no footprints in the dust aside from the ones that already existed from other cars. I tucked the rulebook under the register where the receipt rolls hid and where I had found it. The book fit like something it had been made for. My hands were still trembling as I slid it in. The tag had not come back. I wrote one final line into the recorder, my voice raw, close to breaking but steady in the way people learn to be steady on cold nights. I followed the rules. He left. For now, then I turned the recorder off and slid it into the drawer beside the book. Outside, dawn began to thin the horizon into a flat gray. The highway showed a single taillight heading east. I kept the lights low in the kiosk and wiped the counter with a damp rag until the book stain would not show if anyone looked closely. I left the register drawer slightly ajar. Before I let myself go home, before I told Marla anything more than there had been a call and I handled it, I wrote one more note and slipped it into the rulebook. I wrote the date, the time, what I had done, and I signed it with my full name. Then I pressed my fingers against the paper until the ink was an impression. I pushed the drawer closed halfway and slid the name tag back into its place where the pin would catch the thread on my shirt. The tag felt lighter than it had before, and for the first time in 3 weeks the tag moved freely on my chest. I left the lights on low, locked the door behind me, and walked across the lot toward my car. I paused at the edge of the drive and looked back. The kiosk window reflected my tired face, the crossed bands of fluorescent and dusk. I tucked my chin, tightened the strap on my bag, and walked away while the lot stayed still and the small recorder's red light kept its last image on my hands inside the drawer. The sound of the highway grew louder as I locked the car and drove away, but the rule book was still under the register, and the record in its front cover had my handwriting in it. The final sentence I recorded that night was not a promise. It was a description of a decision. I would keep the book hidden, follow its instructions on every shift, and not tell anyone who might not understand. The night took nothing more before I left. The next morning, the manager stopped by, looked through the window, and said, "Everything okay?" I smiled like someone who had handled a customer complaint, and said, "Yeah, all fine." When I closed my eyes to sleep, the last concrete sound I could call to mind was the small click the drawer made as it settled over the rulebook, as if the station itself had swallowed a secret and folded over it. That concrete noise followed me into the car and into the blur of the highway home. I am leaving a log. I am leaving rules. I am leaving a small recording in a drawer. That is the end of this night. Tonight's actions changed the pattern here. I do not know whether the faceless man will test the rules again, but I do know this. I pulled the tag free and put it down, and the world responded. I pushed the book back into its hiding place with hands that trembled, and the drawer settled with a final, small click. The man at pump 3 knocked his knuckles against the kiosk glass and said, "Help me." I kept my hand on the rulebook like it was warm metal and felt suspicion tighten behind my ribs. Suspicion made me check the door lock, the deadbolt twice, and the dash light on the radio. I could see the paper bag shadow over his head and the payment reader blinking an impossible time. The problem was simple and immediate. He wanted me to let him inside, and the rulebook I found on my first night told me not to. That rule, suspicion, moved my feet before my mouth. I had not planned to be in another confrontation. The morning I found the book on the counter, the man had put his hands flat on the counter and said, "Help me." That memory sat behind every motion now. I was 22, working nights to leave Harper's in a year, and I was already measuring every dollar and every hour. I opened my mouth to speak and closed it because the book's margin note from last night, tiny, cramped ink, was still under my thumb. Follow the page. Do not decide. I felt doubt replace suspicion as I read even. Harper's voice crackled over the radio. It sounded distant and sharp through static. Even, "What's at the pump?" He always used my name like a check. It kept me honest. I swallowed and answered, "There's someone at pump 3, Harper." Paper bag on the head. Asking to come in, my voice was flat. Saying it out loud changed nothing and everything. The faceless man tapped the glass a second time. He tapped in a slow pattern like counting. I watched his hands. They were long, dirty at the nails. He did not move his shoulders when he listened. The head under the bag tilted at an odd angle. I felt fear settle below my sternum and push outward into my palms. I set the radio into the counter groove as if that contained authority. The book told me what to do next. I flipped the rulebook open with my thumb. New ink breathed between the lines. A fresh annotation had appeared on the page labeled "Customer Interaction at Pumps." 4 words in a cramped hand. "Allow exchange, then perform ritual." I had not written that. The ink smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee. Harper had said the rules adapted. My doubt shifted into a brittle, urgent obedience. I stepped out from behind the counter with the cheap lead flashlight clipped to my belt and the name tag that read "Even" pinned crooked to my chest. The fluorescent over the register buzzed. I left it on to keep the interior visible. Outside, the halogen at pump 3 painted the asphalt cold white. The man stood unmoving beside the pump hose. His coat hung in faded black folds, and there was a string of rusted tokens clutched in one hand. Course rig idled in the far lane. A wide streak of red light cut the dark like a wound. "You sure that's a bag?" Call as he slid across the door threshold and peered out. He kept his voice low. Cole smelled of diesel and stale cigarettes. He had big hands and spoke with the flat cadence of someone who drove 6 lanes for a living. Cole had been at the pump for 5 minutes, and already the presence altered his posture. "Even, you see that?" I nodded and felt my mouth dry. "He's asking for help," I said. "He keeps tapping the glass." Carl's face tightened. "Don't you let him in." "Don't you let him in, Ivan." He stepped closer to the window, and the faceless man turned to mirror Cole's leaning stance. The skin where eyes should have been was smooth and slightly lacquered. The faceless customer repeated Cole Essex Ale, matching it to a fraction of a second. My suspicion flared into alarm. "Harper," I said into the radio. He's mirroring Cole. "He's got tokens. The book says." I stopped, saying book sounded like superstition. Harper's answer was a clipped laugh and then a line. "Follow the manual. If it says a ritual, perform it. If it says do not, shut the door and call me. Log everything." Harper's voice shifted my feeling from alarm to reluctant compliance. The rule book had a ritual page. 2 knocks on the counter, recite the line, present a token, close the book. I did not like the idea of ritual. Ritual sounded like a cult or a procedure written by someone who kept secrets. But the ink was fresh, as if someone had written it 10 minutes ago, and the page's margin had a tiny smear of sand. I felt compliance bleed through my limbs. I unlocked the door and opened the glass a few inches. The faceless man tapped 3 times on the counter, soft and precise. When he spoke, his voice was a layered whisper with a thin static undercurrent. "Help me," he said. He hit with the exact cadence the man from my first night used at the counter. That memory, hands flat on the counter, shot through me like a physical reminder. Recognition pushed me toward panic. "What do you need?" I asked. The book sat open beneath my palm on the counter like a promise and a threat. "What do you want?" He tilted his head and mimicked the way I rubbed my thumb along the rulebook edge when I was anxious. The mimicry was precise enough to be cruel. "Gas," he said. "Change." "Help." His repeated words were the wrong answers to simple questions. Cole had come to the door and watched. "Ivan, done tea," Cole muttered. Cole's voice had fear in it now. Deputy Ramos' headlights appeared down the highway, a narrow white bar growing in the dark. Someone in town had called. I felt burden shift. The deputy's arrival was an external event that moved the scene like a hand. A second later, Deputy Ramos was on the lot with a flashlight and a steady step. He was younger than his badge made him sound, his jaw set, the beam of light cutting a triangle across the pump island. "Step back, please, Deputy Ramos." He kept the radio mic pressed to his collar. His voice held training and a habit of using calm to cover uncertainty. The faceless man copied Ramos' stance exactly and then mirrored Ramos' flashlight sweep with a tiny, delayed turn of his head. The deputy's posture wavered. I watched authority falter and felt a different emotion surface, helplessness turning into responsibility. I no longer wanted to obey the book. I wanted to keep the deputy from failing. "Even Ramos over the glass. Do you need me to bring him in?" The faceless customer reached into his satchel and produced a string of rusted tokens. He held them up between two fingers like someone showing a coin to a child. One of the tokens was identical to the ones Harper kept behind the register. My breath snagged. The token was proof the entity had been closer to us than any of us admitted. The token made me angry. Anger pushed aside helplessness. "Don T, let him take the book." I said, "Do not let him touch the counter." "Do not." The sentence cut as the faceless man leaned forward, fingers brushing the edge of the rulebook. He did not touch it. He lined up a token with the crease in the page and let it rest there, as if marking the spot. Deputy Ramos reached for his radio and stammered a request for backup. His hand shook, and the faceless man matched the trimmer a heartbeat later. This mimicry was not mimicry alone, it was research. It pressed against me with a new weight, violation. My suspicion had become focused anger, then redirected into a steady dread. The rulebook's annotation that had appeared earlier now had a second line beneath it. "When token is placed, perform the offering." A single directive followed in a different hand. "Knock twice, speak once, offer token with left hand." There were no reasons, only steps. The book had already rewritten itself since that morning. Harper's voice returned over the radio and cut clean through my scramble. "Even if it tells you to perform, do it. If you hesitate, you give it time to learn." I felt a tightness in my throat. Hesitation had felt like a moral choice, but Harper framed it as a danger. My next feelings folded from anger into resignation, and then into a hard, practical clarity. Choose the action that ends the current terror. I repeated the steps aloud as if reciting a checklist. 2 knocks, 1 line, left-hand token. My fingers found the counter edge. I knocked twice, flat and loud. The sound reverberated across the small room. "This is Harper S," I said, voice steady but low. I paused a beat and then held my left hand out, fingers open. The faceless man mirrored, not the posture, but the movement, and placed the rusted token into my palm. The metal was damp. The token left a smudge of sand on my skin that smelled like old pennies and oil. When my hand closed around the token, the faceless man made a small sound that might have been a laugh. It was a mimicry of something Cole had done when he relaxed his shoulders in conversation. Cole's expression hardened. "Even, what did you do?" he asked. His words were clipped. I slid the token behind the register into the drawer where Harper's other tokens sat. My fingers brushed the plastic name tag, and for a moment I thought of leaving it there forever. The faceless customer took a step back and then, without turning, walked to his van and drove away. The pump light stayed on for a long time after the engine cut. Deputy Ramos stayed for a half hour, filling out a report and asking questions I could answer in one line. Did he speak? Did he try to come inside? Did he touch you? The deputy asked in careful scripts. I answered each time, naming the token, the knocks, the page. He wrote it down, scratched his pen, and repeatedly glanced at the token I had placed on the counter. The token sat on the ledger like evidence of something wrong. Cole smoked outside on the curb and kept calling the faceless man the wrong names, buddy, pal, as if naming him something ordinary might make him ordinary. Cole's routine words were a way to hold on to human traffic. Harper's voice came back once, clipped and low. Log it, tape the page. Fold the token and store it under the register. Do not let anyone see the annotation. The owner gave instructions like a surgeon dictating orders. His voice turned my reluctant compliance into mechanical motion. When Ramos left, he said, "I'll check the cameras and swing by again tomorrow." He did not look at me with the same certainty he had when he arrived. He did not take the token. He nodded at Harper's radio and drove off with the police cruiser lights cutting the horizon. The departure felt like a reset. It opened space for another event. Discovery. I reopened the rulebook to the page where the token's dent had been placed. The fresh ink had another sentence, colder this time. Cost of obedience increases. I read the words and felt nausea. The sentence forced a choice into the open. Follow and the price might be raised. Refuse and the entity would escalate. My emotions shifted from resignation to a choking caution. This was the mini cliffhanger. The manual had rewritten terms and the cost was unspecified. I ran my thumb along the page and found a fingerprint in the margin, small and powdered with ash. I thought of the man from my first night, hands flat on the counter, saying, "Help me." I thought of the tokens in Harper's drawer. The way the faceless man mirrored Cole and Deputy Ramos, and the way the book kept changing. Each of those things loaded the question. Who wrote the book, and why did it adapt to keep us alive? Doubt returned, and then a brief, sharp clarity. The book protected a system with rules that fed on obedience. Cole came back into the kiosk before dawn and leaned his broad shoulder against the doorway. He touched the token with a fingertip and asked, "Even, what does Harper want with these?" He spoke like a man asking for the truth of an invoice. Cole's voice carried exhaustion and the weight of miles. "Harper says they reminders." I answered. I kept my sentences short. He says they make the entity follow a pattern. He says follow the book. Keep it logged. Reminders, Cal repeated, tasting the word like something sticky. He laughed once, small and hollow. Who marks the prices on that thing? Who decides the cost? I did not know. I had pages of instructions and no origin story. I had Harper's orders and a map of actions that kept the faceless man at bay. I had to choose between a set of steps that felt like superstition and a living threat that imitated gestures it watched. When the sky began to lift into a grey bruise, Harper's voice came through the radio one last time. "Send me the scanned page. Fold it twice. Keep the token. Burn nothing. Remember, we are the archive. The rules are the file." I did as he asked. I scanned the page with my cracked phone camera and watched the screen show the margin ink. The image looked wrong, edges wavered, and the token shadow cast across the page looked like a second, smaller token inside the paper. I felt a final shift. Comprehension and terror in the same motion. The book was not static. It changed to keep us compliant and alive, but it also increased the price for each compliance. My suspicion, which had driven my caution at the start, curled into something colder. Calculation. Deputy Ramos called once more before leaving town. "If anything else happens, call me immediately." He my name twice on the line. He sounded less sure than when he had arrived. Cole picked up his cup and left a grease smear on the counter as he went. Harper's radio clicked once, then static. I taped the altered page into an evidence envelope, folded it twice, and placed it in the lower drawer where the tokens lived. The faceless customer's token sat among Harper's other tokens, but it felt foreign. It carried dampness, a smell of paper and oil, and a faint abrasion where it had pressed into the margin. I closed the drawer and ran my thumb along the edge of the book. My hand shook once and then steadied. I had followed the book's instruction. The entity had retreated. The deputy had left. The trucker had driven away. The immediate threat had passed. But the book had changed. The token had been placed there by the same hands that had knocked on my counter the first night. The memory of that night, "Help me," was no longer just a plea. It was an instruction delivered through another mouth. Harper's voice on the radio told me to log the incident and never mention details. He reminded me of secrecy as if secrecy were a tool. I closed the ledger and wrote the time and the token serial into the log. The last thing I did before switching the register to open was slide the small, damp token to the edge of the drawer and whisper the name Harper had told us to use for emergencies. Then I locked the drawer and turned the keys in the counter like we were finishing a bank deposit. Dawn found me alone in the kiosk with the rulebook closed and a fresh crease where the token had rested. The page had returned to its previous ink pattern, but the margin held a faint smear. I put the folded, scanned page into the vendor folder and placed it under the ledger. I told myself the chapter had resolved. The rule had been followed, the entity had left, the evidence was logged. But concrete things had changed. The book now listed a cost that was not a number. Harper's voice had been the last concrete event in the room, and I obeyed him. I flipped the light off and stepped outside to the parking lot. The morning air smelled of cold asphalt and an arriving sun. A single rusted token lay on the pump asphalt where the faceless man had left it. I picked it up with my gloved fingers and felt the rough edge. The cost of obedience sat in my palm like a coin I had not earned. I turned the token over and set it back on the pump cap. I did not throw it away, I did not burn it. I had followed the book, protected the rule, and kept the secret. The earth under my boots was concrete and scuffed with tire marks. The faceless man was gone. But the rulebook had rewritten its price, and that mattered in a way I could weigh with my fingers. I closed the pump hood, walked back into the kiosk, and locked the door behind me, listening to the click as if it were a verdict. Harper's radio clicked on with a soft static breath. He log it clean, no details. We keep running the station. I logged it clean. I wrote the names, called Deputy Ramos, faceless customer. I recorded the token serial and the time the pump read an impossible hour. I closed the ledger and slid the folded page into the envelope with the token. I taped the envelope and labeled it in Harper as shortened, for owner. Then I turned the sign to open and forced a smile for the first customer who wandered in at 6:50, 2 a.m. A man with a bag of road map brochures who asked for coffee and gas directions. I poured the coffee with steady hands and kept my thumb pressed against the edge of the rulebook beneath the counter. The emotion root of the night, suspicion, stayed under my skin. It had shifted several times. Suspicion to doubt, doubt to fear, fear to reluctant compliance, compliance to new calculation. By noon, I had a plan I hated. I would keep the rules. I would write every change into the log and send scans to Harper. I would watch who came to the pumps and note what they left behind. I would not mention the details outside the drawer. The chapter closed with an instruction and a juncture. The book had been tested and had rewritten its price. I had performed the ritual. And the faceless customer had retreated. The concrete event that ended the night was the deputy's headlights leaving town, which left me with a token in the drawer and a page folded twice under the register, and a radio that whispered a final order. Do not speak of this to anyone but us. The faceless man stepped through the service door and put both hands flat on the counter while the fluorescent above flickered. I heard the scrape of long nails on chipped laminate before I could think. Suspicion tightened my jaw so fast my tongue missed the next sentence. Stop, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted. He reached for the rulebook with the same slow, studying motion he'd used at pump 3 the second night. The book was on my side of the counter. I leaned back against the register, keeping one palm pressed to its spine like it might move on its own. I had suspicion in my mouth. I tasted coffee grounds and burnt sugar and the metallic tang of the pump nozzles. I had worked nights long enough to know the difference between someone who needed help and something that wanted an answer it didn't need. The faceless man didn't look like the people who rolled through Harper's no dirt, smeared hands with cigarette burns, no scuffed boots streaked with diesel. His coat hung wrong on him. His head, when it turned, showed no features under the paper bag. I kept my thumb running the edge of the plastic name tag pinned over my chest, as if that itself could anchor me to a right behavior. Hours before, on my second night, a man at Pump 3 had knocked his knuckles against the chaos glass and said, "Help me." I still had that voice in my mouth. I remembered the way suspicion first tightened behind my ribs that night, and how I held the rulebook like a hot plate. I remembered that we had survived that encounter by following the inked instructions. I thought of the previous clerk's recording, the one on our radio that scrolled like a scratched record. I thought of rules being literal here. That memory edged into my hands now as the faceless man leaned forward, and the light made his coat a patchwork of grey. "Keep your hand on it," I said. I kept my voice low because the radio crackled and echoed if I raised it. "Don't take it." The faceless man did not slap at the counter. He put both palms flat, mirrored like someone studying the way a cashier would place a receipt. He tilted his head all the way to the right and hummed a note that matched the jingle on our broken payphone. He nothing else. Suspicion shifted into a new motion. Caution. I lifted the register lid and slid the rule book farther back, tucking my fingers under the pages. The rule book was warm. The pages smelled of oil and cheap toner and the faint sweetness of something burned into paper. I could feel the book's spine tremble under my hand like an animal that knew a trick. I kept scanning the pumps through the glass while I kept a hold on the only object that had given me instructions to follow since the first night. "Ivan." A voice called from the pumps. Night truck driver's shout clipped off against the glass. His heavy boot thumps had a different rhythm now, nervous, impatient. He leaned on the driver's side window, a stocky silhouette in halogen glare. "Everything okay in there?" he demanded. The faceless man straightened. For a moment he borrowed a human shape. He tipped his head and said yes, in a voice that was a scrape of static and the exact cadence of the driver at the pump. I felt something like nausea when the man's lips didn't move, but the voice matched the outside man's syllables. The truck driver was a witness now. I realized the entity could mimic anyone who looked or listened. My caution morphed again. I released the register enough to grab the handheld radio. I switched it on and whispered the call sign for dispatch. My finger hovered on the transmit button and my mouth dried. The speaker filled with static and then a voice with two wide vowels said, "Harper's." "We copy," I said. "This is Ivan at Harper's." "There's someone inside, help," but my words smashed against a delay and came back altered. The dispatcher sounded a second late and far away like a recording on loop. "Harper's repeat," it asked. I repeated harder. The voice returned thin, unit en route. The radio offered nothing more definite. The hum suggested time was still leaking through circuits. The faceless man watched me work the radio with his head tilted. He mirrored the motion of my hand lifting the transmitter as if he rehearsed the move a dozen times before. I tried the landline instead, thumbed in the sheriff's number. The line rung and the call cut to the recorded busy signal. My breath came short. Fear tightened my throat now. That fear pushed me forward toward action. I was not going to wait for a help that came as a rumor. I pushed the counter up between me and him. "Don T touch the book," I said, and this time my voice had weight. "Name tags, receipts, anything with a name. You don't get to touch them." He moved closer until his coat nearly brushed my elbow. He smelled like dry sand and rust. The satchel at his hip clinked with something that sounded like a handful of coins. He did the odd mirrored thing. He lifted his hand and then repeated the last phrase ID said in a voice that matched my own, almost chanting. You don't get to touch them. My hands remembered the rule about names. Page 11 had been explicit. When to surrender a name, offer a token instead. I did not want to offer my name. I did not want to tear at the tag pinned to my shirt. But the rulebook had been right before. The first clerk's radio had warned us. Follow the words. That memory, his last taped breath, creaked into my head. It me to do what the book said even if my body screamed no. Doubt loosened in me like a joint. I flipped the rulebook. A previously blank page winked open like it had been waiting. The ink was fresh and wet in the dim light. The sentence read, surrender one identity token. Keep the token clean. Do not look at the face while surrendering. My eyes went to the satchel at his hip and the rusted tokens that clinked inside. The radio by the register began to play a recorded voice, the previous clerk's file. It came through with a soft electrical rasp. If you're rehearing this, follow the book. It will save you at a cost. His voice cut off with a small pop. An anger I did not expect rose in me. Not anger at the faceless man, at first, but at the situation. I slammed the book closed and pressed my palm flat over it. The faceless man did not take a step back. He set both hands on the counter again and mimicked the action, palms flat and still. He helped me, in a borrowed whisper that sounded exactly like the first sentence I'd heard in Chapter 1. The hairs on my neck prickled. I pulled my name tag from the shirt with a small, precise motion. The badge fell into my palm. I could feel the pin prick the skin under my thumb. The faceless man's head tilted. He let out a tiny sound that matched the night wind outside. Even, he said, slower, testing the syllables. I held the token in one hand and the name tag in the other. The rulebook's paper cut my fingertips. The margin had small flecks of something dark. The air in the kiosk tasted like burnt sugar and old paper. I was not alone in this decision. Outside, the truck driver knocked again against the glass. He shouted, "Hey! Open up!" Sheriff Cole's headlights swept the pumps as he rolled past on the road, slowing. The truck driver put his hands in the window. You okay? He asked, louder. The faceless man smiled a small, human mimicry and answered, yes, fine, in the driver's voice. I watched the man's lips remain motionless, while the voice borrowed the other man's cadence. The truck driver saw the faceless man and froze, then frowned and backed away. Weird, he muttered. That single human reaction made me understand how the entity pulled witnesses into its script, rewriting how others would remember. Doubt turned to urgency. I slipped the plastic name tag between the leaves of the rulebook rather than giving it to him. The page shivered and the book accepted the tag as if it belonged. The faceless man's hand hovered an inch from the cover. He leaned in until the paper bag rustled. Nothing. He mirrored every twitch of my shoulders. He had become a test subject in his own patience. I tried bargaining. Stay there, I said. If you do what the book says, you can go. If you touch it, I want tea. My sentence died. He had no throat muscles to clamp. He had no face to watch for my lie. He tilted his head and repeated the final word I'd used. One tea, with the exact drop of my own inflection. I felt my resolve wobble. The book had taught me obedience by a slow demonstration. It felt like the only tool I had. The clock over the cooler hiccuped. Its hands spun forward 2 hours and then snapped back. The light stuttered. The radio crackled as if someone had slid a record into a player backwards. Time did small, sharp things inside the kiosk. When the clock spun, my vision stung with vertigo. The wall outlet popped and threw a smell of hot plastic into the air. The faceless man used that moment. He reached and touched the name tag through the book, his fingers closing on my token with nails that scraped the plastic. Pain flared along my chest where the pin had rested. I snapped my hand away. He moved to the next rule. Page 16 spelled a worse demand. Sacrifice a personal object that carries your name. Destroy it in sight of the book. The faceless man watched me as if the rule were a script for him to learn by watching my face. He lifted his satchel and pushed the valve of a little tin inside, producing a small flash of light and a smell like pennies. Something inside the tin rattled, tokens perhaps. I realized the rule wanted more than identification. It wanted exchange. Fear morphed into a thin tunnel of calculation. Each command had cost before. It had taken fingers nicked by a ring, a locket burned in a sink, someone's hair cut off and flushed down the toilet. The previous clerk's recording had not said why. It had only said, "Follow it. The cost keeps you here instead of elsewhere." The words offered no comfort. I forced my hands to move on their own. I picked up my cheap lead flashlight and brushed the heel of my palm against the cracked face of my watch. The watch had my mother's handwriting scraped into the back by a teenage job, my name and a date. I could feel its weight. I thought of leaving the watch instead of my name tag. The faceless man smiled the borrowed smile of a man who had learned to perform patience. He watched my hand lift the watch. He mirrored my breathing, then produced a dry, thin laugh that sounded too like the truck driver. He reached to take the watch as if the rulebook had told him to collect the token. I did the thing the book asked. I opened my palm and placed the watch on the counter between us. His fingers closed on it without hesitation. He held it a fraction of a second, and then brought it to his ear and listened as if he expected to hear the time tick. The watch did not tick. The faceless man's face gave no expression that I could read, but his shoulders hunched in a human mimicry of relief. The radio hiccuped, and the previous clerk's voice threaded through again. "Do not look at the face while you surrender." I had not looked. I had kept my eyes off his head, to obey the rule even as my hands gave away a memory. A new line in the book had appeared, neat and fresh. "Keep the token clean. Do not stain it with blood. Do not speak the name aloud after surrender. Tape the token back into place on the replacement page. Hide the previous clerk's notes where the next will find them." The faceless man let go of my watch. He listened, then reached into his satchel and produced 2 rusted tokens. He slid one next to my watch and kept one. He placed the token beside the timepiece, and then tapped it with a dirty nail. It made a noise like a spoon on a bowl. "Thank you," in a voice that sounded like the previous clerk's radio, only slower. The truck driver pounded on the glass again. Sheriff Cole's cruiser idled, lights off, behind the truck. The driver shouted, "Open up now!" But his words came thin through the storefront. The faceless man lifted his paper bag for a breath and looked away. His shoulders dropped like someone who finished a task. For a second I thought we traded properly and he would leave. The rulebook had been obeyed. A sudden, sharp hope snapped through me. Resolve hardened where fear had been. I reached for the register to log the token exchange, to make paperwork of it and maybe make it real. He lunged. The move was not fast like a human's. It was precise and final. He grabbed the name tag and the watch, then clamped my wrist with nail-pigged fingers. Pain slashed my palm where the pin had dug in. I snapped toward him and the counter barked against my knee. The light above cracked and went dim. The radio threw a howl and then a voice that was not any dispatcher I knew spoke. "Rule breaks time." The faceless man had moved faster than I'd expected. This was the climb I hadn't wanted. We traded blows, not many. I shoved with both hands, then braced as he tried to pull the tags. He leaned and pulled until something tore. The name tag came loose. One of the pins scraped the pale skin beneath my uniform and left a raw line. I bit down on a sound and tasted copper on my tongue. In the struggle, the register slid and a small pile of crumpled receipts spilled. The truck driver pounded on the window until his shoulder hurt. Sheriff Cole stepped from his cruiser and called my name through the glass, calm, clipped. "Ivan, are you all right?" The faceless man froze and turned his head to where the sheriff's flashlight struck the pump. For a moment he borrowed Sheriff Cole's voice. "Everything is fine here." The truck driver blinked and then frowned. Sheriff Cole's face scrunched in confusion. "Everything was fine?" He asked the window. The truck driver said, He did, and they both looked back at the kiosk as if to confirm whatever story the faceless man had planted. The faceless man grabbed the register's edge and heaved, using my momentum to yank me forward. My wrist caught on the counter. The rulebook slid, pages fanning like a small hand of cards. A fresh line burned into the centerfold. If a rule breaks, repair it with a sacrifice of identity. Cut the name from the tag and leave the name outside. The faceless man had learned rules about breaches. He was not destroying things at random. He was following an instruction that expected me to break. I made my choice in a flat, practiced motion. I cut the plastic name tag along its seam with a cheap penknife from the drawer. I could feel the knife bite as if into skin. I pushed the plastic aside and tore out the printed even strip. The faceless man watched with the same patient interest as a tax auditor. The sheriff banged on the door now. "Louder, Ivan!" "Open!" he shouted. The truck driver's shadow moved away from the glass. He was looking at Sheriff Cole with suspicion. The faceless man reached and touched the name strip with a clean finger, and then let the strip flutter to the floor. I bent and picked it up with fingers that trembled, then folded it and slid it inside the rule book, tucking it beneath the page the book had demanded. The faceless man laughed then, a thin sound like wind through a tin. He let my watch and the token fall back to the counter, and then he straightened and stepped away, near the service door. He bowed like a customer and left through the same open service door he had used, as if exiting politely. Sheriff Cole threw the door open and came in with the truck driver at his heels. He looked at me, at the scattered receipts, at the frayed name tag in my hands. "You all right?" Sheriff Cole as he reached the counter. My name like an attempt to anchor the moment. He smelled of coffee and leather. The truck driver crossed his arms and said, "We thought someone was breaking in." Sheriff Cole scanned the kiosk and then the pumps. He saw the faceless man nowhere. He shook his head. "No one at the pumps now," he said aloud. He was looking at the dash camera at the pumps, at the empty stretch of highway. He frowned. "You look shaken, Ivan. What happened?" I handed Sheriff Cole the empty plastic strip. Up close he squinted at the cut edges, turned it over in his hand, and then set it down on the counter. "Someone took your watch?" he asked. I nodded. He took in the torn pin mark on my uniform with a steadily unreadable glance. The truck driver, "Did you see a man with a paper bag on his head?" The truck driver, Tom, shuffled his feet and said, "No. He looked normal when I looked. Said he needed help. Funny thing is, he smiled at me and then he was gone." Sheriff Cole looked at the empty door and then at me. "You sure you want to file a report?" I wanted to say yes, to explain every scrape and the new clean page in the book, to play the tape from the radio and have them hear the previous clerk cut off mid-sentence. I wanted evidence. The tape in the radio was warm under my hand. I cued it and the dispatcher voice came back with a synthetic, delayed apology. When Sheriff Cole leaned closer, the tape played a whisper that sounded like the faceless man, but Sheriff Cole shrugged. You were alone with someone who left before we could get here. Maybe you scared him off. Even, he used my name as if to make me human for a second." The truck driver nodded. He was fine, like he said. Tom added. They both looked at each other then, and the certainty in their faces settled into routine. Their memories hardened into aversion that didn't include a paper bag. Their denial changed the stakes. I felt a coldness in the middle of my chest. For a second, doubt and suspicion collided and left me raw. I had followed the rules. I had given a token of myself. The faceless man had vanished. Sheriff Cole left his card on the counter and told me to call if anything else happened. Tom slapped my shoulder in a farewell that felt like a gauze over an open wound. The old clerk's recording finished with a dry click. The rulebook's final line had rearranged itself smaller and more urgent. Hide the last instruction where a new clerk will find it. Leave a warning that looks like a replacement. Live long enough to fold the page. The book expected me to preserve the pattern. I taped the torn-even strip back into the book, careful to keep the glue on the page and not on the plastic. I wrote a single line just beneath the crease in blocky handwriting so the next eye would read it. Do not let it take your name. Use a token instead. I stacked the pages so that the previous clerk's pinned note would sit on top, folded into a corner. Outside, the highway held its indifferent hum. Inside, I felt the bark of my breath still. My wrist throbbed where his nails had caught. My watch was gone. My cheap penknife had nicked my thumb and left a half-moon scrape. The morning light came in sudden and thin through the blinds. Sheriff Cole finished his paperwork and left with a soft, final clack of the cruiser. Tom, the truck driver, drove away in a rumble that took the nickel smell of diesel and the small human warmth of companionship with it. He waved at me from the window, as if he had witnessed only a tired clerk keeping his cool. He had no idea I'd been asked to give a piece of myself and had handed it over. I recorded the confessional log in a voice that tried to be steady. Even Mercer, Harper's gas, I said, third night. I followed the book. I accounted for times, for departures, for names. I said the facts. The faceless man entered through the service door. He asked for help. He mirrored voices outside. I surrendered a token. Sheriff Cole and Tom witnessed part of it and could not later identify a man with a paper bag. I left the log raw and precise. I hid the cartridge behind the coffee filter tin where the previous clerk had hid his. I slid the rulebook beneath a stack of oil, changed flyers and labeled the top of the stack with a sticky note for new clerk, read first. After the sheriff left, I sat on the manager's stool and rubbed my thumb along the book's torn corner. Suspicion had led me into action. Fear had pushed me into the exchange. Resolve had closed the loop and then left a hollow place where my watch had been. I felt something else now, a brittle, careful calm. I had done what the book asked. The thing had gone. The witnesses had unwittingly given me cover. The book had been rewritten and the sacrifice had been logged. I left the back door unlocked but wedged with a wooden broom handle, a weak but symbolic barrier. I taped a folded page of the rule book into the seam behind the counter so a replacement would find it if they looked. The new page would show the scraping where my watch had sat. I placed the torn name strip beneath the folded corner and wrote, in small letters, "Do not say the name. Fold the rest." I stacked the coffee filters over it and slid the tin with the old clerk's tape over the top. Morning threw long shadows across the cracked asphalt, and a single shape moved at the shoulder of the highway. I picked up my broken wrist and checked the plastic where the watch used to be. No time. The name tag's cut pinches left a raw, tactile reminder on my chest. I pinned the cheap even plastic back on off, center and crooked. It did not feel like mine. I walked to the highway and dropped a small thing into the sand beyond the shoulder, my cracked name tag case with the store's logo. I buried half of it with my palm and let the wind cover the plastic. A car passed without slowing. Nothing in the world of daytime traffic registered what ID left. The faceless man was gone, if gone meant the absence of paper bags and rusted tokens and the exact static voice on the radio. I put my thumb once more on the rulebook at the counter and then closed its cover and slid it into the safe behind the register. I left a note in the log, practical dry, rulebook modified per page 17, replacement must read. Tape previous clerk tape to underside of filter tin. I signed my name and then drew a single line through the signature so there would be a physical sign of sacrifice. I did it because the rulebook expected it, because the previous clerk's tape had told me to hide instructions where the next would find them, and because leaving a trace felt like honoring whatever had kept me alive. Before my shift ended, I turned on the radio and set it to the old channel where the dispatch voice lived. I let it hum with static while I cleaned coffee grounds from the filter basket. It offered no clear answer. It played a distant weather alert and then a looped advertisement for instant oil change. I made the coffee anyway. I poured a cup and drank it slowly, counting each swallow. Each swallow grounded me back inside my body. When Tom drove by later that day and slowed, he gave me a nod and a thumbs up. Sheriff Cole rolled through twice and gave the station another glance. Both men had their versions of last night. Neither saw the paper bag or the tokens. Both remembered my calmness, my filing of the report. That would be the story they carried. I would be left with what the book told me to do next. I left the rulebook in the safe, but removed the page I'd written on and folded it into a small envelope. I wrote a single instruction on the outside in block letters. For the next person, read this second. Inside I placed the torn even strip and a scrap of lined paper with the previous clerk's last line pinned. I marked the envelope. Do not look at the face while you surrender. Then I hid the envelope inside the casing of the old store phone, the one that never made calls anymore. It fit flush and was invisible unless someone pried the phone apart. At dawn, I locked the front door and drove away. I kept my headlights on low until the road swallowed the ribbon of black. I drove toward the city without stopping. I did not feel free. I felt preserved. The book had asked me to follow its instructions and I had obeyed. It had asked me to leave a warning and I had left one. The faceless man had tested a rule and accepted his part of the exchange. The sheriff and the truck driver would keep their memories tidy. I stopped once on the shoulder and pulled out the small envelope and folded it again and again until the creases were tight. I could not rip the words off a page. I could not sever what I'd given. I folded it and slid it in the crevice between the car seat and the console. I turned the key in the ignition and let the engine idle a secure, human hum beneath me. My thumb found the place where the name tag had been pinched, and my skin had that thin, hot sting that meant a mark would stay. The final log entry I made from a cheap motel near the interstate was short and factual. I stated times, damages, and actions. The faceless man entered and grabbed the rule book. A new page appeared with command. I surrendered a personal token. Sheriff Cole and Tom were present and later disagreed on the man's appearance. I folded and hid the warning for the next clerk. The rulebook is in the safe at Harper's under the oil change flyers. I ended with a practical instruction. If you work nights here, do not hand your name directly. Offer a clean token, tape it into the book, and hide the note. I did not add any flourish. I stopped the recording and the small screen went blank. After that I tore the motel key from its ring and left it on the table. I walked outside and felt the chill of morning air like a metal card pressed to my cheek. I put my hand into my shirt and touched the faint scar the pin had left. It was small and shallow. It would be a visible thing for a time. It would be a mark I could show if someone asked. But I knew that most people would not ask. I drove until the horizon was a straight line and then turned back toward Harper's to check that the safe had not been disturbed. The safe was closed, the rulebook inside. The sticky note still read "New clerk, read first." The folded envelope was gone from the phone casing. It had been removed. Someone had found it. I don't know if that person was a replacement or the faceless man learning a new trick. I only know the book had expected me to pass on what it demanded. I left a final note in the supply bin under the counter where a new clerk might look for order forms. It read, "If they ask your name, tape a token. Do not say it aloud." I wrote it in my own hurried hand. Then I walked out, locked the door, and left the porch light on. The highway swallowed my taillights. I did not look back. My chest felt tight and steady. I had obeyed. I had followed the rules. The sacrifice had been made. The faceless man had gone. The witnesses remembered a different story. The rulebook sat in the safe, its pages rearranged and its margin ink fresh. I drove until the sun rose fully, and then I stopped at a roadside diner to eat and count my fingers. I checked my wrist where the watch had been and traced the hollow circle that remained. It would be a reminder of what I'd left behind. I left all my details in the log. I left the warning tucked into a hidden place. I did not say goodbye to Harper's. I changed the story inside it and drove away. The last concrete thing I did before the motel checkout was fold the last scrap of paper small and press it into the crease of the motel Bible. I closed it and left without reading the passages. The action was small and precise, and it meant I had done what the rulebook required. I preserved the pattern for the next person to find. The final sound I remember before the motel room emptied was the quiet click of the tape on the envelope as it sealed the warning in place.